Anse, mapastem si kason. So hello, Whitehorse here. Thanks for joining me today. Today we're going to be continuing to uh, produce our musquahuian, or our bear fat. So before we make our bear grease from the bear that we've harvested, after we've harvested the bear, we took off all of the fat that we could possibly get off of it, trying to harvest as much fat as possible from it. Because remember, usually in the fall is when we like to harvest the bear, specifically for the muskihki in the huian, or the medicine and the fat from the bear, because the musquahuian, or the bear fat, gives us bear grease, which is used in many medicinal treatments, sometimes by itself, often with a combination of other medicines, or other muskiki out there, herbs, roots, various plants it's mixed with, depending on what the medicine is being made to treat. But the base of all of that is, of course, musquahuian, or the bear fat. So of course we can't just use a bear fat like this, because it's not going to keep for very long, and if we keep it out of the freezer, then it's just going to spoil and not be of any use. So of course what we're going to do is process this into bear grease, which bear grease, once we've processed it and rendered this fat, that bear grease will keep for years and years to come, if the need be to keep it that long. But we're going to work on rendering this and making it into bear grease today. So of course, hopefully you've joined me when we did the harvest of the musquahuian from the bear, or when we did harvest the bear fat. So now that we've got it all harvested, little bit of cleanup we got to do with it. Of course, we pick off any little hair or any little sticks, and even with stuff like the meat, where the meat is a little thicker, we want to try and cut some of that away, just so the final product that we get is going to be mostly just the bear grease. So I'm just cutting off the larger chunks of meat. And some people just process it like this, because what ends up happening is, you'll see once the process is complete and once we've started to render this down, it'll sort of go into almost like pork rinds or something, where you just end up with what's remaining of from the fat and the meat mixture together. So you wind up with what we call Indian popcorn. Some people like to eat it, especially from a moose, because the fat on the moose is high in traditional nutritional value. Musqua, because it's so rich, you can eat some of it, but because of the great richness of the meat and the fat, you can only eat a little bit. Otherwise it does affect your stomach, and you definitely don't want to see the effects of eating too much rich bear fat or bear meat, because you get it does affect your stomach very much like a strong laxative. So you probably don't want that. However, if you do eat it, you can eat small quantities, and it is tasty. But most people, they'll keep it for store it and just eat a little bit at a time, or mix it with other things, but just in very small quantities. But of course, before we can get to that stage, we have to process this and render it down. So before we can render it down, we can't just throw it in a pot like this as one big chunk of musquahuian, or bear fat. We want it into small uniform chunks that are going to break down easily and release the grease from the fat, because we want that grease. That's what we want. So we want to break it into very even chunks, and in this making our chunks as close to the same size as possible. So we don't want huge chunks, otherwise it takes a long time for it to break down. So I'm just cutting this into strips first that are pretty close to the same size strips. And even then, I'm not just going to throw it in these strips like this, because we want it into cubes, because it'll be much easier to break down once it's into cubes. So you'll see I've got these pretty much the same width on them, and I can just continue until I've got this whole piece like that. Alright, so we finished cutting that piece of Musqueam into strips, equal strips, well, fairly equal strips. One thing you got to remember is that when you're cutting it, we just cut it as is. So even though there's still some meat on here, and still the silver skin is still on there, so anyone who understands cutting, you'll know that very much like human biology, we've got Musqua is not very much different. They've got their outer skin, which their fur is on. Then they've got an inner layer of skin, and then they've got beyond that is where the meat is. But that second layer of skin, which butchers call silver skin, is a very tough layer of skin where all the muscles and meat are held in together. But it's a very strong piece of skin. And even when you're cutting it off of here, say it's kind of hard to cut through. But it's even harder if you take the time to take that silver skin off. You end up losing a lot of your fat. So it's best just to cut it, because remember, we're going to be rendering this down, so it doesn't matter if that silver skin is on there. It's going to be rendered down, and our final product that we want is just the grease product from here. So you'll even see like how it is now, that it's very greasy, and the grease does even come off even just by touching the fat, but still we need all of that grease out of there. So even before, when I gathered everything, of course there are certain things that you need when you're going to be making your bear grease, and you need to make sure you have everything ready. I've got my heat source, which of course is a hot plate here, and I've got a nice huge pot here that all of the fat is going to go in, and hopefully I can almost fill this up once I get it all cut up, because we're going to render it all together. That means putting it on the flame and using heat to draw out all of the grease from there. And there's not much we're going to have to do once we put it in here, because it's going to be not at a high heat. If we put it at a high heat, then it's going to start to burn, and all the protein parts in here, the meat and the silver skin and the other skin where the fat is encased, and that'll start to burn and it'll discolor my grease. I want a nice clean product when I'm through, so I want to render it at a low heat, and that means just putting all of my cut up bear fat into this pot, turning it on low heat and letting that heat slowly work. And as we're going through that process, I'll show you how we take care and watch it and make sure we've got a nice clean final product. But of course, like I said, I've got my heat source, I've got my pot, and I've got somewhere to store the fat, the grease, the bear grease once it is in its final product for use. So when we harvested the Musqueam, the bear fat, we harvested about 15 pounds of bear fat. From that 15 pounds of bear fat, once we've rendered it down and gotten all of the bear grease out of there, we're probably going to end up with about 6 quarts. This is a 1 quart jar. We're probably going to wind up with about 6 quarts of final product bear grease. And you'll see how we get to that point as we go through the process. But of course, I've taken my Musqueam, my bear fat, I've cut it into these fairly uniform or pretty even strips, so they're just the same thickness almost. Now there's some that's a little skinnier, and that's perfectly fine. We're not going to worry about cutting them into perfect squares, because when we're cutting this, it's slippery, and we want safety first, so we're not going to try and rush through or be too worried about cutting perfectly, perfect size, because in the end the heat is going to do its job anyway. So once I've gotten all these strips, I want to make it into cubes. So I'll just turn that sideways now, and again there, almost square cubes from what I've gotten. And I've got 3 chunks together here just to make the process a bit quicker. And I just roughly guess how they're fairly close to being the same size chunks. I don't want them too big, or it's going to take far too long to render it out. I want them a good, kind of a decent size. So if you look at this size here, that's going to render out nicely. So by the time I have this on the heat for a while, we're going to end up with just the tiniest, maybe half a centimeter or even less than that, square, half a centimeter by half a centimeter, little square piece of the skin and the other encasings that keep that grease in there. But it's going to be very tiny. It's going to shrink to very small, and all of the grease and the fat will come out of there using the heat. So I just continue cutting them all, and I'm going to take all of the fat that I've harvested and do the same with all of the pieces of fat that I've got. I'll clean them up, cut them into strips like this, and then those strips, I just put them all into the pot. Everything goes into there. I don't want to waste anything, so everything goes into there, and I just can keep continuing the process with all of the fat that I've harvested. So remember, I had about 15 pounds of fat that I harvested from the Musqueam, and all of that wean, I'm going to do the same thing to, until all of it is into these little chunks, and hopefully until this pot is as full as possible, because I want to put it all in there. That's how I get the cleanest product. If I just put a little bit at a time, what's going to happen is it's going to burn, because it'll get too hot too fast. So it'll burn without the grease being fully released, and then it'll start to discolor and turn brown, and it won't be a clear color. So I want to put lots in there. And for me, I'm probably going to put almost all of this in there and just render it all together. I'm not going to do little pieces like this. Like I said, if you try and do little pieces like this and try and render that down, and not only is it going to take longer, but you're going to get more chance of burning and discoloration. in your final product. So I'm going to continue cutting all of the fat that we have, and then I'll show you the next process. Alright, so we finished cutting up all of our Musquahuian, and we've put it into our pot, and it's already, you can already hear it rendering down with the heat from the hot plate. And now if you look here, out of that 15 pounds, about 15 pounds of Musquahuian, or the bear fat, we've only got, geez, maybe a pound, if that, of waste, which is mainly meat and that silver skin or muscle that really no point in rendering down. So that's all we've got for, so very little waste. The majority of the 15 pounds of Musquahuian, or the bear fat, we put into the pot, and you can see here where it's starting to render down already. So you can even see already at the sides, you can see where the grease is starting to boil out of the fat, and it's actually boiling down, or rendering down very quickly. So what I've got is, I've got a steel spoon here, and every now and then I just want to turn that so I don't get any burnt parts at the bottom. So it does take a lot of time, and you're going to have to watch it and just turn it periodically, just so you don't get any burnt parts at the bottom that'll discolor your bear grease, because you want that bear grease almost completely clear, so you don't want it burning or browning or anything like that. So you just give it a quick stir, maybe every 10 or 15 minutes, just to avoid that, avoid any of it burning and causing discoloration. What I've also got is an extra small pot, because once I see the clear grease coming at the top, because what's going to happen is all of this fat here is going to drop, and it's going to start to see grease on top, and probably when it gets about an inch deep of grease above the fat, I'm going to pour that clean grease, that clean 1 inch of grease into my pot, just so it stays clear, and I'm getting the clearest portions first. So as soon as we get that 1 inch of grease on top, we'll pour it into this pot and get that nice clear, absolutely clear bear grease out of the top of this. So we'll continue to let it render, and like I said, turning it every 10 minutes, every 15 minutes, just to avoid anything burning or browning at the bottom. Alright, so now we could see that it's almost rendering till it's over top of all of the bear fat in here. But we're going to wait just until it gets totally above all of this before we make our first pour on it. So we'll let it go for just a few minutes longer. You can see it's, as everything heats up in here, it was sort of coming up very quickly. So it won't take very long until everything is under the grease. Once it's at that point, that's when we'll make our first dump into our other container, and then we'll continue rendering this. Alright, so we're continuing the process of rendering our Musquahuian, or our bear fat, into Musquapimi, or bear grease. So the bear fat, or Musquahuian, has already rendered down a great deal. You can see it here on the pan that all of the fat is covered by the pimi now, or the grease. So we don't want to risk burning or discoloring our pimi, or our grease. So you can see that our Musquahuian has already rendered a great deal, and it's covered, it's all immersed in this pimi or the grease. So we want to make sure that we get the cleanest pimi or the cleanest grease as possible. So we're going to dump this right now into our a different vessel, and we're going to have a strainer as well. So here I've got another pot here that I'm going to dump it into, but I'm going to run it through the strainer just so I get just the grease. I don't get any of the unrendered fat in there, or any debris or anything that might be in there, because I want the grease to be nice and clean. So I'm just going to dump this now. Now I'm going to continue rendering this, but I just want this portion dumped, because if you look on the very edge here, you could see it's already starting to get some discoloration on there, and that's what we don't want to happen to our grease, because if I keep it continuing in here, then this grease we've already got in there is going to get more and more discolored. It's going to get browner and browner, rather than that nice clear liquid that I want from it. So I'm going to give it a quick turn, and as we're getting more and more rendered down, because you could see the pieces shrinking and starting to brown, we want to start stirring it a little bit more after we dump this nice clean grease. So we're going to dump this now into our strainer here, and I don't want to burn, so I'm going to be using a towel here just to hold it, and very carefully. Remember, this is hot grease. I don't want to drop it, I don't want to spill it or splash it anywhere, so I'm just going to very carefully pour it. I'm not going to pour it all. I want to leave a little bit in there just so the bottom pieces of the unrendered fat aren't going to burn. Because if I poured it all out, then it's going to start to get crispy on the bottom, and probably going to be risking really getting a burnt color in there. So with this, I'm going to just strain it, let all of that clean, nice grease come out of there, and then dump this back in to continue rendering down. And if you look here now in our pot, this is our product that we want. So it's a nice clear grease here, and you could see right to the bottom of the pot how clear that is. That's what we want. We want that maskwapimi. For mainly we use this maskwapimi as maskiki, or for medicine, and for mixing with other medicines for them to help people who are sick or in pain. So we'll continue rendering this down now. And we'll continue stirring it more and more so we don't get any brown discoloration in there. So once again, I'll wait until all of the pimi covers all of this, and it's all below in the grease before I dump it again. So we'll continue the process. Alright, so we're going to continue this process. So what happens is when we're rendering the fat down, it's going to get, as we get lower and lower to the bottom, and more of those discolored pieces are going to blend in with our maskwapimi. So we kind of run them separately, so that first pour, I want to keep that separate because that's the cleanest. So this was, that was this pot full. I'm actually going to pour that in another pot because this one has a lip on and it'll be easier to pour into my jar. But I'm going to dump that into a different pot because that is the cleanest batch that I'm going to get. dump that into there. And then I'm going to dump this into here, and you'll see the difference in the color. So once again, I put my strainer on top. Get my towel, and I'm going to dump this run because it's all of the fat is submersed now in the grease. And you'll see that the pieces, the fat pieces, are getting smaller and smaller as they render down. Again, I don't want to pour it all out. I want to make sure there's some in there just so we don't get any burn on there. Strain this out. Put this back to continue rendering. So as we had mentioned before, the lower and lower we get and the smaller and smaller pieces we get, that's the more we want to be stirring this so we're not getting any pieces burning and completely discoloring our final product. So we're going to continue letting that render. Where this one, we've still got to let it cool because we don't want to shock our jar. So this is the final process here now, where we take our jar, and with our jar I just heated a little, just holding it over the pot just so we don't shock the glass and end up having the glass shatter on us. So this here has cooled enough that I can dip my finger in there without burning. So it's cooled enough that I can pour it into my jar now, and that's our final process. So I'm just going to take our jar and very carefully pour our Musquapimis into our jar for our final step in the process. So again, very carefully, and I'm just going to let that sit for a minute. Again, I don't want to shock the glass because it's not like canning where we submerge the jar in water to heat the glass and not shock the glass, because of course we're working with grease here and not just water mixtures. So again, making sure pour just a little bit at a time so as not to shock the glass, and let the glass warm and let the grease cool as a natural process. So I'm not just blindly pouring it in there. Otherwise there's a chance that the glass will get shocked and it'll shatter on me. So again, a little bit at a time. Allowing at least a few seconds to let the glass warm up. And I'll just continue that process until my jar is filled. Again, allowing that natural process to take place, where the heat from the oil transfers onto the cooler material of the glass, not shocking it. And again, allowing just a little bit of time for that glass to not be shocked. And probably one last pour just to top off this jar. There we go. I'm leaving just a little bit of space on the top. So now that we finished that is the final process. Now with this, I'm going to let it cool until it's completely cool. And before I put the cover on it and seal it, like I said, I want to make sure it's cool. If I put the cover on now, there's a chance that the jar could be damaged, because as that liquid cools in there, it's going to tend to try and suck in and seal, and it may damage my lid. So I'm just going to let this cool, just being open like that, before I take my lid when it's all done. And you might even just put it on there but not tighten it. but it does cool faster if you just leave the lid off. And your final step will be putting that lid on once this is cool. So again, with the next batch, I'll just continue this process until I have all of this Musquaquemi in jars. And like I said, I think it looks like with this run, we're probably going to get about 6 quarts out of there. And that's enough to last me throughout the winter months, or probably a lot longer. But with as with anything that we gather, especially for muskiki, or we do a lot of trading, so this I can trade with another gatherer for maybe some roots that I haven't been able to gather this year. So we do a lot of that and helping each other out. Some people may not have gotten their Musqua this fall and might not have been able to make Musquaquemi, and it's a lot of work. And I'm finding more and more that as our elders get older, the younger ones are just not wanting to do that work. So hopefully we can pass this teaching on so more and more people can do it, and we'll continue that practice of collecting Musquaquemi for muskiki. So that is the process of making, harvesting a bear for our bear fat, and finally to get our final product of Musquaquemi. So thank you for joining me in this little series. Hope to see you in the next series. Pinanas kong tinawaw, kakyaw, pagsimaga.